And we'll just get started in a minute. Get started, and as people trickle in, hopefully they can join us. Thank you so much for being here today with me. I am very honored and excited to be sharing a little bit more about my journey and how we've been really working together with the community to co-create spaces of healing and agency, specifically with the immigrant community. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that today. The framework of the conversation, I think it's super important to just do a little bit of like some logistics. So if you have any questions or any comments that are coming along, feel free to use the chat featured. A friendly reminder, this conversation, it is being recorded by Catalyst 2030. They're gonna be posting the video for those who couldn't join today live in their website. So you'll be able to access that well after the presentation. So if you don't want your lovely faces to be featured today for whatever reason, feel free to like turn off the camera feature, but I think that is so important to build community. So if you're able or choose to, if you can put your camera, I would love to see your faces. So we're gonna get started on that note, just to like get some of the logistics out of the way. So thank you for those of you who introduced yourself in the video and those of you who introduced yourselves in the chat. So I'm going to be sharing my screen with you all to get us started, to provide some context about how we're going to be spending the next hour all together here. So let me make sure that everything looks good to go. So here you go. Something that is super excited about participating in this type of conversation. I am so honored to be an Echoing Green Fellow. They're part of a global community that supports entrepreneurs, and they join forces with other foundations and organizations to create this campaign around Catalyst 2030, to really have conversations about the impacts around COVID-19 and how it's impacting different communities, specifically around the social development goals created by the United Nations. And it's with this hope about how do we catalyze, how can we catalyze and how can we accelerate the impact of these social development goals. So if you're not familiar with the social development goals, don't you worry, we'll dive in a little bit deeper into that. So the hope of today, is really framing around that work. But before we dive into that, I think context truly matters. So I want to get started a little bit with some context on demographics. This is a global audience, and sometimes I am guilty of that. I'm based in the US, and when I think of migration, I typically think about my Arizona community, the US community, my family, my friends, and sometimes it can be overwhelming when you take a step back and think about the scale of the issues that we're facing. So if we take a balcony outlook, as many people call it, and we think about the immigrants across the nation, if we think about the US has the largest migrant population, this includes undocumented and lawful citizens or residents. So we're talking about a little bit over 44 million people that are living in the US that were born in another country rather than the US. So that is 18% of the whole world's population. So we're like the leading #1 people that have the most immigrants. Second after that, with about 12 million people, which is about 4% of the whole world's population, is Germany, followed by Russia, the UK, and France. So I wanted us, as we're having this conversation, to really allow ourselves to think a little bit more broader and more globally about some of the challenges, but also the unique opportunities that can come about if we imagine what would it look like if we really lean in and listen to those 44 million people that have such a unique range of experiences and assets and different ways of showing up in the world. So that's a little bit about some of the context. So what does that mean here in the US? Aliento, it translates to breath for those of you who might not be familiar with Spanish, but when you give aliento to someone, it's like giving words of encouragement. So I'll talk a little bit more about our mission and the work that we have been doing here in the United States with undocumented and mixed status communities. But in the sake of context, I really wanted to zoom in about in the United States, since we do some work not only in Arizona, but nationwide. What does that mean? Who are we talking? How do we build some common language? So then we can dive in and have a more conversation in a little bit after we are able to build some commonality. So we're talking about 17 million mixed status families. So if you remember, 44 million are immigrants overall here in the United States. And if we're talking about the mixed status families community, it's typically those that some people might be legal in a family that is defined whoever lives in the household, and some of them might be undocumented, or many of you might even heard the word dreamer. So out of the 17 million people, we're talking about 11 million people, which is about 60% of them are undocumented or unauthorized, meaning that they don't have the lawful documentation to be here in the United States. And 5.5 million, which is about 30% of the 17 million, are US citizen children that live typically with one or more parents in the household that are unauthorized. And then we have about 9.8 dreamers that many of academia calls it the generation 1.5. So those are people like me who came to the United States at a young age as minors. So we are in this in between, and dreamers can be undocumented students or young people, or it can also be folks that have DACA status, which is a temporary protection from deportation that right now it's in limbo in the Supreme Court, and we don't know what the fate will come with that program. So now that we're able to build like some context, what does this mean if you're not in the United States, or maybe you're in Arizona or New York? When we talk about the specific children population that tend to be the most vulnerable, we're talking about a size of a country as big as Syria or Guatemala or the Netherlands. So that's the type of the community that lives in mixed status families. And when we zoom in into the children, it equates to the same population as places like Finland and Singapore. So I want us for us to pause there, because sometimes numbers can be used and we don't take the moment to really reflect that these are people that are going through and experiencing very different journeys like any of other human beings, with highs and ups. And when we really think about the impacts of a global pandemic and our health crisis that we're facing, how do we really ground ourselves in these moments about the importance of really going beyond and understanding that this is going to have long-term consequences if we're not able to really lean in and listen. So with that brings me to my why. This is my beautiful family. Some of you have had the privilege to meet them. These are the people that ground me. And I wanted to start with my family because my own story is so deeply personal. I've not only studied migration in my undergrad, been in the front lines of activism for the past 10 years around immigrant rights movement, but I had to flee violence from Mexico after my dad got kidnapped, and having to face a lot of trauma of not understanding at a young age what it meant to escape the country that you call home, and seeing that police officers were behind the violence inflicting to their citizens. So my story really begins with the deep desire and courage of my mom and dad to going to seek another opportunities in other countries, specifically for the safety of my brother and I. We didn't have Angie, my little sister, who's now a beautiful 7th grader here in the United States, who is a middle schooler. We didn't have her. She was born years after we migrated, but I really wanted to start to really share a little bit about me, you know, who I am a DACA recipient. I am part of the 1.5 generation that is being stuck in legal limbo right now, that I don't know what my fate holds. And also my brother is a DACA recipient. My dad, after 7 years of being in deportation proceedings, it has been granted his asylum case. So he has been recognized by the US government as an asylum seeker. And then my mom is still undocumented. So all these complexities, when we talk about mixed status families, we're talking about families like mine. Moving a little forward, I wanted to provide more context about the young people that I've been able to work with, and really talking about from the elementary level as we're thinking about this education continuum and working with these communities. When we're talking about mixed status families, we're talking about Angel Palazuelos, students who didn't have the opportunity to our current political climate to apply for the DACA program, so they're vulnerable to deportation. We're talking about students like Angelica Pacheco, who are DACA recipients, who are working so hard to get a degree. We're talking about other DACA recipients like Blanca Sierra, who is a fierce mom who just got her master's degree last year, and it's in the front lines of COVID-19, working as a social worker in our hospitals, who has 2 US citizen children that are sitting in our K-12 classrooms and have to live with this uncertainty of, one, their schooling being interrupted and having to adapt, as many of us are doing it, and really having to face the disproportionate impact that it comes to knowing that tomorrow we don't know if mom is only going to come sick from the hospital after working a long shift and hours trying to serve our nation in this global pandemic, but also having to face the reality that we don't know if one day that mom is coming from home, it's not only going to be exposed to a disease, but it's going to be exposed to not knowing if she could be deported if the DACA program were to end. So we're talking about students that come with families that have parents just like mine, that are really figuring out a way about how to continue to thrive and have those beautiful smiles and continue to be citizens of the world. So I wanted to provide that context because we're seeing the complexities at the very individual level, as someone like Darian, you know, who is an undocumented student. His younger sibling is a US citizen and his parents are undocumented. So what does that mean? What happens at the family level, and how are we keeping these stories in mind and actually are investing in the leadership of young people to thrive? So prior COVID-19, this is not a new problem. This is not something that we just decided to do. After we heard about COVID-19, we in Aliento have been in operations for a little bit, almost 4 years. We're celebrating our 4-year anniversary this year. And our whole mission is to transform trauma into hope and action with undocumented DACA and mixed status families. And we have this 3-pronged strategies where we cultivate the people that we work with through our arts and healing programming, where we nurture leaders and allies to really be invested in their development and build the knowledge and the skills to self-advocate, and we transform, right? How do we make sure that we're changing the policies and the systems that are creating the trauma in the first place? So for us, we have developed this three-way thinking about how does healing and agency look like with working with vulnerable populations, in this case with the immigrant community, about how do we really have that point of transformation when healing, you know, it's not like I'm gonna do all this journaling, I'm gonna do 10 hours of yoga, 10 hours of meditation, and I'm gonna be healed and I have arrived to my destination. We all know, we all who have experienced loss, we all who have experienced pain, regardless of your immigration status, we all know that healing is a journey. So for us, it's how do we understand that this trauma, it's immigration-based trauma, that it has been created by systems and policies that are not protecting the most vulnerable populations and that systematically are excluding them. So for us, we created this infinity loop to really understand if we want to be able to build empowered, impacted communities that are going to be leading equitable solutions, we have to start from proximity. We have to start with understanding the population, listening to their needs, but also listening to the assets and the attributions that they bring, because they're brilliant people, they're resilient, and they have so much to contribute in terms of not only economically, but also of ideas. So by us investing in the individual and in the community, we're able to have this point of transformation about leading equitable solutions. As I said, before COVID-19, we were doing this work, and we do it in a multi-generational lens. And I wanted to bring the voices of Diana Morelos, who's a DACA recipient here in Arizona, who shared before COVID-19 what healing means to her. And she said, "It is crucial to understand that my parents also have trauma from their early life in Mexico. They were focused on survival and had no time to heal past traumas." So at the end of the day, for us, this is the core of the work that we were doing prior to COVID-19. How do we invest in young people and their families to have this collaboration, to have this deeper understanding that there's so much that we're carrying as immigrants, and how do we create spaces for us to support one another? And these are some other pictures that I wanted to share with you. This was definitely before COVID-19, since we've been doing very strict social distancing and sheltering at home with the team. But we brought 300 people, 300 students and allies who, the majority of them, it was the first time coming to the state capitol and speaking to lawmakers to be, it goes beyond my story, just kind of like Diana mentioned, the importance of doing the inner work, but also understanding that we're a village. And if we want to create systems and sustainable change, it's going to take a village, and it's going to take impacted people and their allies to come forward and ask decision makers, in this case elected officials, what is your solution and why haven't you acted? And how can I help you to build a bridge of understanding about my reality and how policies at the educational, immigration, and health level are not serving our communities. Also wanted to wrap up with beautiful Jade about our core group, before COVID, before I move into some of the interventions, so we can ideate some possibilities about how have we responded as an organization at COVID-19, but also how this is bigger than Aliento, and how we can come together and really be thinking about, when we're thinking about the immigrant community in the US, but also outside of the US in the global context, what are things that we can do to better support and be advocates for one another, as we're thinking about this big framework from the United Nations about creating sustainable developmental goals for our well-being of whole humanity. So for me, it's about really building those moments where with little kids are working in a multi-generational lens, from parents can be whole and can really be able to access their humanity and also understand their value and their worth. So with that, I really wanted to shift gears a little bit about what has been the response around COVID. We were doing all our programming in person. We had already served 25,000 people in person. Out of those, 8,000 were young people stepping into leadership. We have a social media footprint of 100,000 people at that time. And then COVID happened, and at that moment, as many people were facing this threat of feeling anxious, feeling worried about our own health, our family's health, and having to be really interrupted about our day-to-day lives. So for us, one of the most important things as we responded about COVID-19 was that we can't be shifting our programming immediately. We can't be acting if we don't listen. So the first step that we took was to respond with care, and we communicated with our students and families. How did that look like? That looked like doing a bunch of text messages. Before COVID, every 2 weeks, we were already sending 1,000 messages to our students and families. Post-COVID-19, as everything was folding up, we were getting 100 messages daily on our social medias, on our phone number, and on our website. and emails. So for us, it's like, how do we make sure that we are responding with care? We were doing one-on-one support. We created a survey. And for us, it was really important to listen and to learn what were the actual needs of the community, even though that 100% of my team, my leadership team, is people of color. 100% of them have an immigrant parent. And yet, that doesn't mean that we are in the same place and we represent 11 million people or the 17 million families that are struggling. So for us, it was really to lean in and understand what were the immediate needs. And through all of that, we got to listen and got to experience very hard truths that our students were facing, that our families were facing. So I want to take a moment to read this journal entry. Part of the work that we do, we work with students to provide leadership development. And one of my team members, big shout out to Jose, who really wanted to ask students, I want you to journal, because our stories, the stories of people of color, typically don't get recorded in history. Typically, we are invisible to the stories that come in the news. So for us, it was really important for their mental health and their well-being, but also for us to document history about how they were experiencing COVID-19. So this journal entry is from April 7, 2020. And it is from Angel Palazuelos. I have asked for his permission to share this. He is an Aliento Fellow and he's a senior in high school who's just graduated, and we're so proud of him. And he's based in Phoenix, Arizona. In his voice, my education is all I have, and it is currently under attack. Not only has this pandemic instilled a great deal of fear in my community, it is also causing me to be robbed of my education. The school is no longer open, and teachers are no longer teaching. The Phoenix Union High School District has called for all teachers to provide recovery work and overwork the coverage of new material. Many of my friends, family members have lost their jobs due to this crisis. This has caused them to step up and work to cover the cost of living. They are putting their lives on the line. These people are my friends, and their health is at risk. The students have no incentive to study. All we have to do is survive. Before, I was confident about my transition into college. Now I am uncertain about what is to come. We won't even be able to say our last goodbyes. Having no internet service and 6 screaming family members fumbling into the cord every 5 minutes makes learning from home not an easy task. We have been trying to set up Hope Internet for almost a month now. I have called various internet companies numerous times, put on hold for hours just to be told that they cannot provide me their services because my house is too far from the post. After doing some research, I discovered that satellite internet was our only option. This type of internet beats everybody in the market for being the most expensive and the slowest as well. No 1.5 megabytes per second for 150 is not worth it, and not enough for a 6-person household. So much has been taken from the class of 2020. There were so many memories that I wanted to make, so many bonds that I wanted to fortify, so many things that will no longer happen. In the future, seniors won't be able to reminisce about prom, about how prom was the best night of their lives and how much fun they had in their senior trips. Lost memories. Remember, this is only temporary. So I've read this many times and I still feel a bodily reaction as I hear the voice of Angel Palazuelos. My hands are sweaty and my flight freeze or fight response comes in. So I want to invite you right now, for the people who are live, but if you see this recording, to take a moment and take a deep breath. Inhale with me. Exhale. Inhale. Exhale. 17 million people in the United States have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. These are people. These are human beings. And as we continue our journey, we kept hearing from high school students, from parents who were struggling to pay for rent, who were single mothers, who were so worried to being evicted, who were struggling with paying rent, with finding food. And that's the reality our team had to face. So what did we do with holding so much pain and so much sorrow? We really had to adapt, and we had to figure it out. How do we make sure that the current work that we're doing continues to be very mission-centered, about really creating spaces of healing and transformation and agency with the migrant community, but also respond to the immediate needs? So the top 3 needs that, after serving over 400 families and having thousands of conversations one-on-one, we learned that at the end of the day, it came down to these 3 specific trends around needing financial, educational, and emotional support. So the way that we were able to respond, we leveraged our networks, we leveraged our partnerships, and we were able to do an immediate emergency fund where we had a goal to raise $25,000 to help 50 families here in Arizona, in our local community. If I can be very vulnerable with you all, we put this very ambitious goal for us. We're a small organization that has been only in operation for 4 years. So we were very optimistic. We had a lot of hope, but we thought it was very ambitious. And honestly, we thought it was gonna take us a month to get to this goal, but we decided to move forward with that. The reality was that we were able to meet this goal, $25,000 goal, in 1 week. So among crises, we were able to see and witness the generosity of people. And in 1 week, we fundraised $25,000. Then we were able to leverage our local and national partnerships. And we were able to fundraise over $100,000 to support 230 families with $500 cash assistance, so they don't have to worry about being evicted, so they don't have to worry about feeding their children. And as of now, I am so proud to announce that we have gotten the money directly in the hands of over 200 families out of the 230. So that took a lot of work, and it took a lot of effort, and we learned that it wasn't only in Arizona, but in a lot of remote states here in the United States, from Mississippi to Puerto Rico, that is not even a state, that is a commonwealth, and it's in a very different global political conversation for another time, but they didn't have enough resources. Typically, resources don't trickle down to the island from the US. So we wanted to really support these families and really serve as a bridge builders within education agencies. We work with our partners at Mesa Public School Districts to become translators for parents as they had questions around e-learning, as they had questions about where do they get tested, do students need to still go to school, what's going to happen to their learning, how can they continue to learn if they don't have laptops, if they don't have Ethernet, as we just heard from Angel's voice. And we also shifted our arts and healing programming that was happening in person completely virtually, where now families multi-generationally can come not only from Arizona, but from Michigan and across the United States that are joining our programming to really build community and find that emotional support that they really need in these moments to break that isolation. The last thing that we did, and I already talked about, is really leverage our partnerships, and we became bridge builders. So we know that in order for us to create sustainable and systemic change, it has to go beyond aliento. So how did we work with our institutional partnerships, from schools to governmental agencies, and really be able to provide culturally competent information to our families and students? So as I said, we became translators and bridge builders among families and schools, and families and governmental agencies. There's one story specifically where I had to talk to 9 different governmental agencies just to find out if some DACA recipients and undocumented immigrants could qualify for unemployment? And the answer vary. For DACA recipients, it's unique. Undocumented people don't qualify for unemployment benefits, but DACA recipients like me are in this weird limbo that we're not citizens, we're not legal permanent residents, but we're not undocumented anymore. So we had to do a lot of conversations. I talked to senators, I talked to House of Representatives at the local and national level, the governor's office, and I got all different answers. So imagine being an undocumented parent, worrying about having a job and having 3 children and not understanding how to their own power or not understanding how to navigate the structures and systems. So how are they getting the information? How can they understand if they are able to get food support or get unemployment support during this pandemic? So for us, it was really important that we develop a form, but also know that education is something that it hits this specific community so disproportionately, because a lot of them have very limited literacy even in the Spanish language or their native language. So for us, we created these videos to transfer and figure out different ways from calls, text messages, videos to really provide this information as it was so evolving and adapting. So with that, I really wanted to pause there we have been in this journey, about providing context when we're talking about undocumented and immigrant community. Who are we talking about? Then we move into understanding about the mission, about Aliento and the work that we were doing prior COVID-19. We also explore some interventions that we were able to respond immediately after COVID-19. And now we really want to frame this conversation in these last minutes that we have together. What do we go from here? What is the future? And now that we understand this, or maybe we've been part of the community and maybe we have years of experience with building bridges, with figuring out how do we support the most vulnerable, or maybe you are outside of the United States and you're thinking about your own undocumented community living in your country. Where do we go from here? What are some ways that we can partner to really accelerate the sustainable development goals? And what are the key questions that we want to ask? So as this conversation comes, if you haven't been familiar, the United Nations put up a call saying that by the year of 2030, so about 10 years from now, they want to be able to accelerate and create significant impact around these 17 sustainable development goals that are going to help us, all humanity, all human beings across in our planet. So for us at Aliento, and when we think about immigration at the larger context, we really wanted to dive in about the disproportionate impact that COVID-19 is going to have around the well-being. There's 1 in 10 people, regardless of immigration status, that are already experiencing mental health, lack of access, lack of support, or lack of understanding. We also want to talk about the quality of education. When we talk about this specific community, I've been in so many different conversations with educators that are so ready, with the school leaders that are so ready to go back into the classrooms to figure out e-learning platforms, but are we missing the mark? Are we jumping into action before listening? Are we actually inquiring from the most impacted and most vulnerable communities? Or are we crafting our curriculum and our responses with the people that already have access and that are privileged by having technology to have Ethernet infrastructure? And how do we make sure that we are also understanding the great deep innovation that comes from impacted leadership, that it comes from communities coming together to figure out how do we make sure that we're not missing the mark, but continuing to impact this global pandemic in the future and having this large disproportionate impact, specifically with the migrant community that tends to be excluded from financial aid, that tends to be excluded from resources like basic needs like food and unemployment. And how do we make sure that we understand that this threat of being exposed to a virus doesn't discriminate. It's not going to be asking us for our papers, but it is going to disproportionately impact not only the undocumented community that have little to no access to healthcare, but also low-income communities and people of color. So with that, for us, as we're having this conversation and we open it up to Q&A, and also for you to share your thoughts about this presentation, I wanted to provide the framework about whenever we think about partnerships, what are we looking for partners? We're looking for people who are gonna be invested in the long run, who are gonna be bold in their approach and are gonna be fearless about centering community and people, that are not going to be centering institutions, that are going to be centering people and what is most needed for people. We're looking for partners that want to join us in this journey of being bridge builders among different platforms, from educational institutions to governmental agencies, and have it this deep sense of responsibility that is not the immigrant community in one side and our community in another side, but we are one community. We live in one nation, one globe, one earth together, and the work that we put in of investing and cultivating in the next generation of change agents, it's gonna be better for all of us. So as I wanted to open it up for Q&A, I really wanted to frame this, and I really want to learn from you all as well. What are the things that you're doing to ensure proximate leaders and impacted people are really centered of the solutions and decision-making of all the processes, whatever nonprofit, whatever sector or industry that you are? And I really wanted to share this picture of people, because at the end of the day, if we have this bold approach and everybody, regardless of immigration status, start believing that they can change the world, this is the place that I want to live. This is the place where I want to see my little sister grow up. And this is the place where I want us all to be in community. So I'm going to open it up now for conversations and Q&A. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can see each other and really have this conversation about, as Catalyst 2030 is compiling information across the nation, what are the things that we want them to consider, specifically when they're talking about in this framework of social cohesion and peace within the migrant community? What are the things that we want the United Nations to know? What are the models? What are the recommendations that we have? So I'm gonna pause there. You can either unmute yourself, or you're also welcome to write your question in the chat. But this is not only a Q&A, but really a place for us to be in conversation about what do we wanna know? What do we need to understand in these moments as allies, as impacted people, to make sure that whenever we are gonna be past this pandemic, because it's a matter of when, no if, that we don't miss the mark. So I'm gonna pause there. Any questions, any comments? So I hear a lot of silence. It might be because there's a lot to process. So I do want to acknowledge that. Maybe I can start with a more basic question for you all, and then maybe we can build up from there. So can we start sharing, anyone who is in the call, how have you seen the response either from government or educational institutions to support the undocumented community? Are you seeing that lacking, or are you seeing that, oh, actually, like, our community is doing 100%? What have you witnessed? What have you bear witness to?
I think, unfortunately, my name is Angelica Cesar. Here in the state of Arizona, we have not seen that response. And also at the national level, you also see a lack of response and like actually centering the lives of undocumented workers and of mixed status families. You see it in the simple act that our families were left out of the CARES Act, so we can't receive financial relief. In states like Arizona, we don't have access to unemployment benefits. So I think from my experiences and what I've witnessed, it is lacking.
And Angelica, if I may ask a follow-up, as you hear all of this, what do you think is something that people need to understand? Or in this case, you know, we have this platform about Catalyst 2030. What would you wish people in the United Nations or leaders across the nation would consider?
I think the first and biggest thing that should be considered is the fact that immigration status or not, these people, we are still human beings. We are still impacted by tragedies like COVID-19 and other externalities that are going on. So that's first and foremost. Our lives matter too. I think another is the importance of just listening to the community and listening to our needs and listening really to what our experiences are under not just COVID, but with different policies that are carried out at the national and state levels. So I think just centering our voices and our experiences.
Thank you, Angelica, for sharing your insights. There's a comment in the chat that's saying, here in Chicago, I know that undocumented families have not been able to receive the help that others are receiving. I actually have to bear witness to that. So thank you so much for sharing that. And hopefully I'm not mispronouncing your name. It's Beth. Thank you for sharing that. Actually, we have gotten a lot of inquiries, and something that I forgot to mention as we were creating our own fund to support families with cash assistance payment. As I said, we started with a small idea of thinking about how can we get 50 families here in the state of Arizona. And actually we ended up opening it up nationwide, and a lot of families from Illinois reached out to us, specifically from Chicago and the outskirts of Chicago, sharing that they were not receiving a lot of assistance. And sometimes that can be very daunting, and it can be, sometimes you're like, well, where do we find the agency and where do we find the support? Because in these moments, it's the real reality that government has failed us. And government is failing not only undocumented and mixed status families, but the government is failing every single human being. Because as we know, specifically when we're facing a global pandemic, the spread of the virus, it's pretty high. And how do you reconcile the need of one, in one hand, holding the failure of the response with this specific community, and the other hand, the importance of co-creating solutions and not getting caught up in this blame shift, right? Because it's so easy for me to be like, the government failed us, there's nothing that we can do. But at the end of the day, we do have agency, and we do have a voice, either by joining these webinars that are gonna be uplifted in different platforms, or also figure it out, you know, how us, as I said, we're a mighty team of 9 who never thought that we were gonna be raising $25,000, but we were able to leverage our relationships and our networks to really support families. And there's a saying in Spanish that it says, poner tu granito de arena, which translates, if everybody puts a small part, you know, then we can really hold this sustainable change. Because it's not, as I said, it goes beyond Aliento, it goes beyond one organization. This is a global crisis that if we don't listen and we don't really understand the nuances of working and supporting this community, we're gonna miss the mark. So thank you so much for sharing that. What are some other thoughts or questions that you have faced right now in your communities?
I have a question, Reina. In order to serve the families, have the families reached out to you as an agency, or you reach out to the families? By experience, I work with parents who have children in our Mesa Public School District. We have a family literacy program where we teach English for parents and help them with their children's education. And what I experienced is that I've been calling the parents to, at the beginning, I was like, okay, there are gonna be the more impact on these families because of their legal status. And I start worrying immediately about their financials and how they're gonna pay the rent. So I start, looking for resources where to get help for them. But when I contact the families and I ask them, do you need anything. How can I help you? Are you okay with the payment of your rent or your utilities? I found out that these families are always in a survival mode, and they know how to go on. They have created this community sense, and they help each other. They say, oh, don't worry, my mom or my neighbor, we're saving for each other's rent for next month. And it was, something comes out to me because they're afraid to ask for resources because of the legal status, maybe could be. The calls that I've been getting are scarce, asking for resources as more emotional support than financial support. And they know that there's some resources that I can help with, but it's like, no, we'll take care of it. My husband works in landscaping. I just started working with him. And so they're not always waiting for the help. They're resilient, that they know how to feel their needs. And there's something that I really learned this time from them. So again, back to my questions, did you look for the families, or they reach out to you?
Thank you, Norma. Before I answer the question, I really want to honor and show gratitude for you bringing so much depth of context, because that's something that we face on the day-to-day. Sometimes it's cultural, a lot of it, resilience. I see it as a double-sided sword, double-edged sword, as the saying says. It's that sometimes when you're resilient, you're able to do so much with so little. But also at the same time, when you really need the help, or you need the support, sometimes this is where the cultural barriers really come in. People take a lot of pride from working with the immigrant community, and being from the immigrant community for the past lifetime, being part of it and working for 10 years in community work. People are prideful, and they take pride of their work and working hard, and that's just such a value. I don't want to generalize 17 million people, but as I said, after 10 years of working with them on a one-on-one, I've seen that people take a lot of pride. So we did a hybrid of both. There were families that for the first time disclosed, this is the first time that I'm asking for help. And they would email us and message us sometimes 3 to 4 times a day. And we had to jump on a call, try to do a little bit of de-escalation, a little bit of mindfulness, and also be very vulnerable and share our stories. As I said, a lot of my team, it's very uniquely positioned, and I think we were very lucky to have that direct experience, either through our uncles, through our own parents, or even living in ourselves, to see that, hey, we have to do this with a lot of care. And that was our response at the beginning. How do we communicate with care and compassion and empathy? Because it's so vulnerable to ask for help. Imagine if you are struggling, your inclination is to hide. And that's a survival mechanism. People either fight, freeze, or flight. That's a survival mode. So by us having this understanding on healing, and having this understanding on trauma and what happens when you're exposed to trauma, because living through a pandemic, it's a traumatic experience. How do we make sure we have that lens before we even say, do you need help? And I think for us, yes, that takes longer, that takes more investment, but that's what actually worked. Some of the families that we even been working for 2 years, they didn't recognize the Aliento number when we called them. And they were like, what do you mean you're giving me $500? This is a scam. That is not true. And Jose from our team, had to be like, remember we were in this event and we were doing at the Capitol, and I know your daughter, she was in our leadership program, and being able to provide that sense of validation and comfort, but at the same time, understanding that there's very valid questions at the structural system that people had. If I receive this help, is it gonna hurt me in adjusting my status in the future? And being able to have that combination of not only care and empathy and compassion, but the knowledge and the know-how of these responses that are so unique to this community. And I don't want to call on my team, but I'm going to open it up specifically with Jose. If you have anything to share, Jose, around working with this community and really responding to our hybrid approach of one, receiving the inquiries, but also making the attempt to talk to families directly on a one-on-one and us reaching out. Would you mind sharing, Jose? A little bit? Maybe he's not, maybe his connection dropped. But I think that, Jose, are you there? So can you share a little bit about your experience?
Yeah. Sorry, I was just actually messaging one of the persons. And the reason why was that she's undocumented, so she doesn't have a state ID, and her passport, she couldn't find her passport, so she couldn't cash the check that we were able to give her. So we were just trying to figure out a different way that we can support her. So we just have to jump through a lot of hoops because of the way the system is in place. Specifically here in Arizona, it's different than other states, and it varies state by state. We do get a lot of calls from Massachusetts, Illinois, California, and Texas. And the easiest to deal with is California, because they have the matriculas, the consulate IDs, and the passports work. So you just start to learn more about how different states work. But it's really rewarding. At times it is frustrating because you do hear a lot of pain and a lot of suffering that people are going through. Specifically when you have, and I think about myself as well, because you have like older parents who don't know how to navigate some of the technology, and the children, they're like 10, 11, 12 years old, the ones helping them out. And then you hear the kids, and it just becomes this, like, I just remember my mom telling me, hey, you're like 10 years old and you don't know how to translate this. Like, what do you go to school for? And they don't do it because they're mean. It's just because it's a frustration and upset that you're trying to finally I've been able to have a hope, and I can't access it because I can't access technology. So to me, it's like, how do we help close that gap?
Thank you, Jose. And what I want to echo, right, is like when you're working with people, is this like really deep understanding that these conversations that parents might be operating out of like crisis and survival response, you know, like wanting to have the money so that they can support their students and support their children. And sometimes they say really hurtful things that as a child, I remember vividly when I was young, and my dad getting mad at me because I couldn't translate, and he thought that I couldn't help. And that stays in my heart, right? And even though that I know my dad's intentions to do better, like that hurt me. So how do we move beyond the hurt, and how do we build not only the bridges across agencies, either institutional, educational, or governmental, but at the same time, how do we build these bridges among generations? Because there's a huge generational gap that sometimes get missed when you're working with families. And how do we have this like true framework about approaching? And I got a question in the chat saying, how can we help those who are not receiving the help they need? Do you have any recommendations? So we're gonna be coming to the end of our session, but I do wanna be able to answer that conversation, and hopefully you can walk away with very tangible next steps. So I'm gonna reshare again my screen, so then I can talk a little bit more about how can you show up? How can you show up for this community? How do you show solidarity and support in these times? So one thing that is like super important, how do we remember that we need to listen, and that listening is leading as well? Understanding that solutions come from proximity, and we had all this conversation around context, and like I would have not known how to address this population if maybe I would have not experienced it as a young girl, having to translate very difficult information from my parents. So the way that I'm gonna approach it is gonna be very different than, let's say, someone who has never had that experience. Number two, share your treasure and your knowledge. Now you've been part of this conversation. If you have the possibility to donate, we have a huge waiting list that we're continuing to support families. So you can directly make a donation, or you can share your knowledge. They can maybe you can share the resources that we have that are based here in the U.S. Or you can also tell them about the survey that we have, so we can put them in the waiting list. And number 3, be in partnership. We are one community. We at Aliento, we don't claim to know all the answers. We see ourselves as bridge builders and part of a larger ecosystem and community. So we are always trying to put out the best information on our social media and in our email. Feel free to sign up to the newsletter so you can get the most up-to-date ways on how you can continue to be part of this conversation, because I hope that this is the beginning of our relationship and a journey that we continue to be together, regardless if you're in Arizona or outside of Arizona or even outside of the United States. And with that, I'm gonna wrap it up, and I wanna thank everybody. The Catalyst team, it did an amazing job of putting this together. They're gonna be having the audio recorder in their website. It's gonna be available in YouTube and in their website. And also, I wanna ask you if you can take 3 minutes of your time after this session to respond to this survey. We're asking you if you want to be part of our mailing list. There's no pressure if you don't want to be part of it and receive the news. Don't worry, that's okay. You can just follow us on social media. But also we want to learn. We think it's really important when we are building together about that it's a two-way street. So your feedback really informs our practice and we take it very seriously. It shouldn't take more than 3 minutes. And if you complete the survey, we will send you a link to download the PDF version of one of our beautiful art that was created by our creative and digital director, Diego Lozano, who's an incredible artist. So feel free to do that, and we'll be sending you a digital printout so you can download and print if you complete the survey. But it is 12 here in the state of Arizona, and that is time for me to close up. So I just wanted to show a lot of gratitude and say thank you for being part of this conversation, and stay tuned to the report that is gonna be coming up to be sent and share with the United Nations. So I hope you have a lovely day. Also, my friend from Catalyst is gonna be putting the link in the chat, so feel free to take it from the chat box right there. But with that, I wanna say thank you and have a lovely day. Take care.